Right. Well, in court, my defense was first and foremost a defense of necessity, that my actions were to prevent a much greater harm, both in the long term and more immediately. So I'll talk about the long-term harm I was seeking to prevent first of all. The number of deaths as a result of the climate emergency is going to rise, and rise dramatically. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England and now UN climate finance envoy, put it very simply in a statement to the BBC at the beginning of February this year. When you look at climate change from a human mortality perspective, it will be the equivalent of a coronavirus crisis every year from the middle of this century, and every year, not just a one-off event. We all know COVID is an emergency. Currently, it's caused about 100,000 deaths in the UK and 2.5 million globally. But by the middle of this century, the climate emergency will cause that number of deaths every year, and then rising after that. However, the huge number of deaths is not the only problem. In his April 29 documentary, Climate Change: The Facts, David Attenborough, corroborated by leading climate scientists, said that, in his words, the climate emergency will result in irreversible destruction of the natural world and the collapse of our societies. That collapse of our societies will be the result of widespread famines and food shortages, flooding, deadly heat waves, and mass migration as significant parts of the planet become unlivable. Now that I fully understand the total catastrophe that is coming our way, there is not a day goes by that I do not worry about the climate emergency. I think about the risks to my 3 adult children in particular. I am consumed by the thought that they may not reach old age as a result of the climate emergency. I've talked about this with Claire, my wife. We both fear for their future. We know all 3 of them are resilient and adaptable, but we worry that that may not be enough. For the last dozen years or so, like many others, like many listening to this, I have done my best to reduce my carbon footprint. I run a recycling company. I've written to my MP. I've signed petitions. And yet the emissions keep increasing. That approach has failed. The politicians of all hues that we elect to represent and protect us have failed to put policies in place that will prevent climate catastrophe. So knowing as I do that there will be a huge number of deaths, irreversible destruction of the natural world, the collapse of our societies, and at the same time that our government's policies are hastening those outcomes, what could I do except find the most impactful way to blow the whistle on the inaction of our politicians? I ask you, in which universe could it possibly be morally justifiable to ignore those facts? That is what made my actions necessary. So I took action to avoid that long-term harm to my own children and to millions and millions of others. But I also took action to avoid immediate harm. There are people dying as a consequence of the climate emergency now. For example, on the 8th of February this year, a retreating glacier burst in northern India, killing over 100 people. Across the US, there are climate change-induced snowstorms this month that have caused over 20 deaths and left millions without power. And back in October 29, there were people dying as well. In 2019, according to Christian Aid, Cyclone Idai caused over 1,300 deaths. The Extinction Rebellion protests that took place in October 2019 could have been successful in persuading the UK government to take immediate measures on the climate emergency. And had they done so, as hosts of the next Paris Agreement COP meeting, our example could have been followed by other governments. If that had happened, I have no doubt at all that some people who are now dead would still be alive. That also made my actions necessary. So to sum up, I would much rather stand in court this year to defend my actions than to try to look my grandchildren in the eye in 20 to 30 years' time, trying to defend my previous inaction. Thank you.